My name is Vanessa Hale. I'm 32 years old, and the first time my boyfriend called me controlling, he didn't raise his voice. That was what unsettled me most. If he had shouted, slammed a cabinet, or turned the conversation into some obvious ugly fight, maybe I would have known how to defend myself. Maybe I would have recognized the moment for what it was. But he said it so calmly, so evenly, like he was handing me a fact I had somehow failed to notice about myself. Your controlling behavior is suffocating me, he said. I need someone who trusts me. We were standing in my kitchen when he said it. The overhead lights were too bright, bleaching everything in a cold yellow wash that made the room feel sharper than usual. The dishwasher hummed in the background. A glass of water sat untouched near his hand. Outside, the street was quiet, but inside that room, something in me had already started to fracture. I remember staring at him and nodding once, slowly, not because I agreed, but because my body was buying time for my mind. I just asked a question, I said. He crossed his arms and looked away, jaw tight, like I had already exhausted him. That's the problem, Vanessa. You're always asking questions. That word stayed with me long after we went to bed. Controlling. It echoed in my head while I brushed my teeth, while I folded the throw blanket on the couch, while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling next to a man whose breathing turned slow and even far sooner than mine did. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to find the place where I had become the villain in a scene I still didn't understand. Because from my perspective, nothing dramatic had happened. I hadn't accused him of cheating. I hadn't gone through his phone. I hadn't told him who he could or couldn't see. I hadn't demanded explanations for every minute of his day. I had asked one question, and that question only existed because of a photo. He had gone out that night for what he called a guy's night. I hadn't thought twice about it at first. I'd always believed that a healthy relationship had room in it. Room for friends, room for separate lives, room to breathe. He used to say freedom mattered to him, and early on, I'd admired that about him. He seemed self-aware, mature, not clingy, not needy. He smiled when he talked about space as if it were a virtue, as if needing it made him honest. I respected that, I really did. Later that night, I was curled up on the couch with my laptop half open, pretending to answer emails I no longer cared about when I saw the story he posted. Music, drinks, smiles, and women. Not strangers blurred in the background. Not people who had simply wandered through the frame. Women standing close enough to lean into him, one with a hand on his shoulder, another grinning beside him like they had shared an inside joke moments before the picture was taken. There was a softness there, an ease that didn't match the version of the evening I had been given. I stared at the screen longer than I want to admit, not because I had proof of anything, I didn't, but because the image created a gap between the story and the reality, and once I saw that gap, I couldn't unsee it. When he got home, I didn't confront him. That part matters. I waited until the next morning because I didn't want to be impulsive. I didn't want to be unfair. I wanted to make sure I wasn't reacting to insecurity dressed up as intuition. So while the coffee brewed and pale morning light stretched across the counter, I asked him as casually as I could, "Why were there women in the photos?" He didn't blink. He didn't look surprised. He didn't laugh and explain. He didn't say they were co-workers, old friends, girlfriends of the guys he was with, or anything else that might have made the whole thing feel harmless. Instead, he looked at me like I had exposed something ugly about myself. "You don't trust me," he said. "That's controlling." It was so immediate, so polished, that I felt my confidence slip before I could grab onto it. The conversation changed shape in an instant. Suddenly, I was no longer a girlfriend asking about something that didn't make sense. I was the woman making him feel watched, restricted, suffocated. And because I loved him, because I wanted to be fair, because women are taught in 100 quiet ways not to become too much, I started examining myself instead of the discrepancy. After that, things changed in small ways at first. Every time I asked where he was going, I saw his shoulders tighten before he even answered. Every time I asked who he was with, something in his tone cooled. If I mentioned that a plan had changed 3 times in one day, he'd sigh like I was exhausting him. If I noticed that he turned his phone face down every time it lit up, I would tell myself I was imagining the pattern. Eventually, I stopped asking as much. Not because the questions had gone away, but because I didn't want to become the kind of woman men describe in stories to make themselves look innocent. I didn't want to be paranoid, dramatic, needy, difficult. So I adapted, quietly. I laughed off things that made me uncomfortable. I swallowed follow-up questions before they reached my mouth. I told myself trust meant restraint. I told myself love meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, even when your stomach tightened for reasons you couldn't explain. But little things kept piling up. Canceled plans with thin excuses. Conversations that seemed to stop the second I entered the room. A new vagueness in his stories. Not enough to accuse, just enough to notice. And every time I noticed, the answer came back dressed in different words, with the same message underneath. You're reading into things. You're insecure. You're making a problem where there isn't one. You're controlling. The night he said it again, really said it, something in me finally slowed down enough to see the pattern clearly. We were in the kitchen again. Same hard light, same two clean counters, same quiet hum of appliances filling the space between us like static. He had just come in late, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't the one he wore to work, and when I asked if everything was okay, his expression shifted into that familiar disappointment, as if I had failed another invisible test. You're suffocating me, he said. I need someone who trusts me. I looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't angry. He was confident, certain. He said it like someone who believed the script still belonged to him, like he already knew what role I would play next. The apologetic woman, the understanding girlfriend, the one who would soften first, the one who would promise to do better, even if better meant becoming smaller. I felt something inside me go still, and in that stillness, an uncomfortable truth rose cleanly to the surface. He didn't want trust. He wanted the absence of friction. He wanted to move however he pleased and never be asked to account for the shape of it. He wanted freedom, but only the kind that came with constant emotional cover. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list the photos, the late nights, the changed plans, the face-down phone, the dozens of tiny moments that had accumulated into a private ache I had been carrying for months. I just nodded. You're right, I said calmly. I should trust you more. For the first time all night, his body relaxed. Relief moved across his face so openly it almost hurt to see it. He smiled, faint but satisfied, like a difficult conversation had finally been resolved in his favor. That's all I've been asking for, he said. I gave him a small smile back, but something had already changed. From that moment on, I stopped trying to prove I was safe for him to love. And very quietly, without drama, without warning, I began to step back. At first, he loved the new version of me. That was the cruelest part. He mistook my silence for growth. He thought my restraint meant I had finally learned the lesson he had been trying to teach me all along. When he went out, I smiled and told him to have fun. When he said plans had changed, I told him it was fine. When he came home late, I didn't ask where he had been or why his answers never seemed to arrive until after the fact. He noticed the difference almost immediately, but only in the way people notice comfort returning to a room. He became lighter, easier, more affectionate in those short, polished moments that cost him nothing. He kissed my forehead more often. He called me sweet when I didn't ask questions. He touched my waist in passing, as if rewarding me for finally becoming manageable. You feel different, he told me one evening, smiling as he loosened his watch and dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. In a good way. I was at the counter slicing strawberries I suddenly didn't want anymore. I looked up and smiled back. Maybe I'm just learning, I said. He walked over and kissed my temple. This feels healthier. Healthier. The word sat oddly in my chest, because nothing about me felt healthier. I felt quieter, yes, more composed on the outside, but underneath, I was beginning to understand that peace and numbness can look almost identical from a distance. I hadn't found some enlightened new level of trust. I had simply stopped volunteering to be hurt in the same old ways. Still, I kept going, not dramatically. Not in a way anyone outside the relationship would have noticed. I just stopped reaching for him emotionally every time he pulled away. I stopped filling every silence. I stopped rescuing the atmosphere after tense moments with jokes, softness, or understanding he had not earned. When he said he might be out late, I said, okay. When he canceled dinner because something came up, I said, no problem. When he scrolled through his phone during the little time we had together and smiled at messages he didn't share, I told myself nothing at all. The first week of freedom, he went out 3 nights in a row. Normally, even on my best behavior, I would have checked in once, not to interrogate him, just to ask if he got there safely, or whether he wanted me to leave the porch light on, or if he thought he'd be home before I fell asleep. The kinds of small, ordinary questions people ask when they are still allowed to care out loud. This time I didn't send anything. At midnight, my phone stayed dark on the nightstand. At 2 in the morning, still nothing. At 4, I heard the front door ease open with exaggerated care, followed by the muted sound of his shoes in his hands instead of on his feet. He stepped into the bedroom expecting darkness and paused when he saw my lamp still on. I was sitting up in bed with a book open in my lap, though I had read the same page 6 times and retained none of it. He froze for half a second. "You're still up?" "I couldn't sleep," I said. His eyes flicked to my phone, then back to me. "You didn't text." There it was. Not guilt, not apology. Surprise. I slipped a bookmark between the pages and set the book aside. "You said you wanted trust." His face softened almost instantly. "Exactly." He smiled then, relieved in a way he didn't bother to hide, but he kept looking at me a beat too long, as if something about the scene had not unfolded the way he expected. He changed in the bathroom and came back smelling faintly of mint and some perfume-like trace beneath it, something floral and expensive that clung just enough to make my thoughts sharpen. I said nothing. I turned off the lamp. He slid into bed beside me, and in the dark, I felt him lie awake longer than usual. The second week, his schedule became unpredictable in ways that now sounded rehearsed. Everything came with a maybe. Maybe I'll be back by 10. Maybe we can do lunch instead. Maybe my friends are stopping by. Maybe I forgot to mention it. Our plans became temporary by default, as if anything involving me could be rearranged to make room for something more urgent, more exciting, or simply less accountable. He canceled on me twice that week, once for drinks that turned into a whole thing, and once because an old friend was suddenly going through something. I didn't push. I didn't ask which friend. I didn't point out that his voice changed slightly when he lied, flattening at the ends of sentences as if he were trying to keep every word level. I just nodded. He started offering explanations I hadn't requested. It was spontaneous. We lost track of time. You know how it is. I always said some version of, "Sure," and every time I did, I saw the same flicker cross his face. Relief first, then confusion, then something more alert, almost restless, like he was listening for a note in me that never came. One Thursday night, he came home irritated for no clear reason. He tossed his jacket over the chair instead of hanging it up and opened the fridge without really looking inside. I was on the couch with my laptop balanced over my knees, answering a client email, and I sensed the mood on him before he spoke. "You've been distant," he said. I looked up. "Have I?" He shut the fridge door a little harder than necessary. "You don't ask how my nights are anymore." I held his gaze for a second, long enough for the silence to sharpen between us. "You said questions felt controlling." A crease formed between his brows. "That's not what I meant." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so painfully clear. What he meant was that he wanted freedom with reassurance attached to it. He wanted independence without emotional risk. He wanted the liberty to move however he pleased while I remained exactly where he left me, warm, available, receptive, endlessly understanding. But he didn't know how to say that. Maybe because saying it plainly would have forced him to hear how ugly it sounded. So instead he stood there in our living room, looking at me like I had changed the rules without permission. "I'm trying to respect what you asked for," I said quietly. His mouth tightened. "That doesn't mean act like you don't care." There it was again. That hidden expectation. He wanted me reduced, but not absent. Less vocal, but not less devoted. Easier to handle, but still emotionally on call. My silence was only acceptable as long as it continued to prove my attachment. The second it stopped feeding him, it became a problem. I saved my email draft and closed the laptop. "I do care," I said. "I'm just not going to keep proving it in ways that make me feel small." Something flickered across his face then. Annoyance, maybe. Or the first faint recognition that I was no longer standing exactly where he had left me. He looked away first. "You're twisting this." "No," I said. "I'm listening." He didn't answer. He just muttered that he was tired and disappeared into the bathroom, leaving the room full of the aftertaste of a fight that never fully happened. That became the pattern. The more I stepped back, the more he seemed unsettled by the space he himself had demanded. By the third week, he had mostly stopped telling me where he was going, unless logistics forced him to. He assumed, I think, that I no longer needed to know. But I noticed something else, too. He started watching me. Not openly, but I saw it in the small pauses. When he came home later than expected, his eyes went to my face before he set down his keys. When his phone buzzed and he stepped away to answer it, he glanced back once as if checking whether I was paying attention. When he posted photos, he seemed to wait for some sign that I had seen them. I gave him nothing. And because I gave him nothing, he started filling the silence himself. One night, he came home talking too much. The story arrived before I had even asked for one. "It was just a random get-together," he said, pulling off his shoes. A few people brought friends. It wasn't even that interesting. I looked up from my tea. Okay. He lingered by the doorway. And honestly, I'm kind of exhausted by people lately. I nodded. You should get some rest then. He stared at me as if I had missed the point of a test question. A few days later, on a gray Sunday afternoon, he sat across from me on the couch while rain tapped lightly against the windows and said the thing I think he had been circling for days. I feel like you don't care anymore. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual confidence. I studied his face. I care, I said. I just stopped controlling. The words landed between us with a softness that made them hit even harder. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. I held his gaze and, for the first time in a long time, felt no urgencies to fix what he was feeling. No, I said, it's exactly fair. He looked at me then like he was seeing the shape of something irreversible. And deep down, I think he was right. After that conversation, something shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone outside our relationship would have noticed. But inside it, the balance was gone. He started paying attention again. Not to me in the way I had once needed, but to the absence of what I used to give him. It was like he had only just realized that something essential had been quietly removed from the structure. At first, it showed up in small things. He lingered longer when he got home, like he was waiting for a question that never came. You're quiet tonight, he said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter while I rinsed a plate. I'm just tired, I replied. He didn't move. Nothing else? I dried my hands and looked at him. What else would there be? That seemed to frustrate him more than if I had accused him of something outright. Because now, there was nothing for him to defend himself against. No tension he could flip back onto me. No emotion he could label as overreaction. Just space. The next few days, he tried to pull me back into the version of us that made him comfortable. He asked more questions. Small ones, but deliberate. How was your day? Did anything interesting happen? Are you okay? If I didn't know him, I might have thought he was trying to reconnect. But I did know him, and I could hear the difference. He wasn't asking because he wanted to understand me. He was asking because he wanted to feel the old rhythm again, the one where I opened up, leaned in, filled the silence, made him the center of the emotional exchange. I'm fine, I told him each time. Simple, neutral, complete. That unsettled him more than anything else. One night, he came home earlier than usual. I was at the dining table with my laptop open, a soft lamp casting warm light across the surface. The rest of the apartment was dim, calm, quiet in a way that used to feel comforting between us. Now it felt distant. You're working late? He asked. Just finishing something up. He stood there for a moment, then walked over and sat across from me. Usually, I would have closed the laptop, given him my attention, asked about his night. This time, I finished typing the sentence I was on before looking up. What's up? He leaned back slightly, studying me. You didn't ask where I was. There it was again. Not concern. Expectation. I met his gaze calmly. Did you want me to? He hesitated. And in that hesitation, something cracked open. Because the honest answer was yes. Yes, he wanted me to ask, not so he could be controlled, but so he could feel chosen, centered, prioritized. So he could feel like no matter what he did, I would still orbit around him. He exhaled, looking away. That's not the point. I nodded slightly. Then what is? He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. The next shift came faster. He started bringing things up without being asked. There were a lot of people there tonight, he said casually one evening, dropping onto the couch beside me. I hummed, eyes still on my book. Some girls from work showed up too. I turned a page. Okay. Silence stretched. You don't care? He asked finally. I looked up at him, not sharply, not accusingly, just steadily. I trust you, I said. The words landed exactly the way his had weeks ago. Calm, certain, unemotional. But unlike him, I wasn't using them to control the conversation. He shifted beside me, something restless moving under his skin. That was the moment I understood something with absolute clarity. He didn't want trust. He wanted engagement. He wanted reaction. He wanted to feel like he mattered enough to disrupt me. The more I stayed steady, the more he started unraveling in small ways. He checked his phone more often, but now he angled it differently, like he was aware I might see, even though I never looked. He laughed a little louder when he told stories, like he was trying to fill space that used to be occupied by my curiosity. He touched me more randomly, my arm, my waist, my shoulder, as if physical closeness could substitute for emotional connection he no longer knew how to access. One night he reached for me in bed, pulling me closer. I let him, but I didn't melt into it the way I used to, and he noticed. You feel different, he murmured against my hair. I stayed still for a second before answering. Maybe I am. He pulled back slightly, searching my face in the dim light. Different how? I held his gaze. Less confused. That hit him. I saw it in the way his expression flickered before he masked it. What does that mean? He asked. It means I understand things better now. Like what? I could have said everything. The photos. The late nights. The way every question I asked had been turned into a flaw in me instead of something to be answered honestly. But I didn't. Because I didn't need to. It just means I'm not guessing anymore, I said quietly. He stared at me like he was trying to read a language he had never bothered to learn. And for the first time since we met, he didn't look certain. A few days later, he said something that confirmed everything. We were getting ready in the morning, moving around each other in that familiar, shared space that now felt slightly misaligned. I miss how you used to fight for us, he said. The words were casual, almost offhand, but they landed harder than anything else he had said. Because there it was. Not I miss you. Not I miss us. Not I want to understand what's happening. He missed the effort, the reassurance. The version of me who would have argued, defended, explained, chased, softened, and adjusted, whatever it took to keep the connection intact. I looked at him through the mirror. You mean when I used to try harder than you? I asked gently. He frowned. That's not fair. I turned back to the sink, rinsing my hands slowly. It's just honest. He didn't respond, because again there was nothing to argue with. That was when I knew for certain I wasn't in the process of losing him. I had already lost the version of him I thought I loved, and what was left was someone who didn't know how to stay once he wasn't being centered anymore. After that, everything felt quieter. Not peaceful, just stripped down. Like all the extra layers we used to wrap around our problems had been peeled away, leaving only the structure underneath. And once you see the structure clearly, you can't pretend it's something else anymore. He tried, though, in his own way. For a few days after that morning, he became more attentive again. Not consistently, not deeply, but noticeably. He texted more during the day, asked if I'd eaten, sent a random thinking of you message that would have made me smile a month ago. Now I just read it and put my phone down. When he came home earlier than usual one evening with takeout from my favorite place, I felt something twist in my chest. Not because it fixed anything, but because it reminded me how easy it would have been for him to do this all along. You've been working a lot, he said, setting the bag on the table. Thought you might not want to cook. I looked at him for a moment. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. But I didn't lean into it. Didn't reward it with warmth he hadn't been offering consistently. Didn't let a single gesture rewrite weeks of imbalance. We ate in relative quiet. Halfway through the meal, he looked up at me like he'd been holding something in. Are we okay? There it was. Not a fight. Not an accusation. Just a question, finally. I set my fork down. We're different, I said. His jaw tightened slightly. That's not what I asked. I met his gaze, I know. Silence stretched between us. Heavy, honest, unavoidable. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I don't like this version of us. I let that sit for a second before answering. Neither do I. That seemed to catch him off guard. Because for the first time, I wasn't positioning myself as the one who needed to fix it. We were both sitting in the same reality now. And it wasn't working. So what are we doing? He asked. There was something different in his tone now. Less control, more uncertainty. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. I think we're seeing things clearly, I said. He frowned. What does that even mean? It means, I continued calmly, we finally stopped pretending we want the same kind of relationship. That landed harder than I expected, because he didn't argue immediately. He just sat there, processing. I never said that, he muttered after a moment. You didn't have to, I replied. His eyes snapped back to mine. So now you're just deciding what I think? No, I said softly. I'm paying attention to what you do. That was the line he couldn't move, because actions don't argue. They just exist. You wanted freedom, I continued. I gave it to you. That's not, he started but stopped himself. Then what is it? I asked, not sharply, just directly. He exhaled, frustrated. I just didn't want to feel watched all the time. I wasn't watching you, I said. I was trying to understand you. That's the same thing. No, I shook my head. It's really not. Silence again. But this time it wasn't tense. It was revealing. Because the more we talked, the clearer it became that we had never been arguing about the same thing. He wanted to move freely without explanation. I wanted honesty without having to chase it. He wanted space without emotional distance. I wanted connection without feeling like a burden. And somehow those two things had been pretending to coexist until now. You've changed, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Yes. Something flickered across his face, not anger this time, something closer to loss. But you didn't tell me, he added. I did, I said. When? When I said I'd trust you more. He went still, because now he understood. or at least he was starting to. "That's not what I meant," he said again, but softer now. "I know," I replied, and I did. He hadn't meant for me to step back. He hadn't meant for me to stop centering him. He had meant for me to become easier to manage. And the difference between those two things was everything. A few days later, the conversation came back. Not planned, not dramatic, just inevitable. It was Sunday afternoon again. The same couch, the same quiet light filtering through the windows. But everything felt different now. He sat across from me, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped together. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. I looked at him, really looked. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the instinct to reassure him. "I think you already did," I said gently. That hit him harder than anything else. I saw it in the way his posture shifted, the way his shoulders dropped just slightly, the way his eyes searched mine like he was trying to find something familiar and couldn't. "That's not fair," he said, but there was no real force behind it anymore. "I know," I replied softly, "but it's true." He leaned back slowly, running both hands through his hair this time. "So what, that's it?" he asked. "You're just done?" I didn't answer right away, because this was the moment everything had been leading to. "I'm not done because I stopped caring," I said finally. "Then why?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Because I started respecting myself more than I needed to be understood by you." Silence. Complete, final. And in that silence, everything between us shifted into something that couldn't go back. The conversation didn't explode. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic accusations thrown across the room like weapons meant to wound. That would have been easier. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like something that had already ended, and we were just catching up to it. He stared at me for a long time after I said it, like he was waiting for me to soften, to take it back, to say something that would reopen the door I had just quietly closed. "You're serious," he said finally. I nodded. "I am." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something familiar return. Defensiveness, irritation, that instinct to push the discomfort back onto me. "So that's it?" he said. "You're just giving up?" There it was. Not what happened, but how he needed to frame it. "I'm not giving up," I said calmly. "I'm stepping out of something that stopped working." "That's the same thing," he shot back. "No," I shook my head slightly. "It's really not." He stood up then, pacing once across the living room before turning back to me. "This is exactly what I meant," he said, voice rising just a little. "You twist things. You make it sound like I'm the problem." I stayed seated, steady. "I'm not making you the problem," I said. "I'm just not making myself the problem anymore." That stopped him. Not completely, but enough, because that was the shift he couldn't argue with. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt different now. Not tense, just exposed, like everything we had been avoiding had finally been placed out in the open, where neither of us could pretend not to see it. "You didn't even try," he said after a while, quieter now. "You just changed." I almost smiled at that, because I had tried, for months, in ways he had never noticed, because they had never required anything from him. "I did try," I said. "You just didn't like what it looked like when I stopped trying your way." He looked away, and for the first time, he didn't have a response ready. The silence stretched long enough for something else to settle in. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to realization. "I can fix this," he said suddenly, turning back to me. "We can reset. Whatever you think is wrong, we can figure it out." There it was, the bargaining, the part where the story tries to rewrite itself before it ends. I held his gaze. "You don't think anything is wrong," I said gently. "You think I overreacted." "That's not," he started. "It is," I said, still calm. "And that's the problem." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair again. "I didn't think you'd actually leave," he admitted. That sentence was the one that stayed with me. Not because it hurt, but because it explained everything. He hadn't believed there would be consequences, not real ones, not the kind that removed me from his life completely. He thought I would adjust, compromise, stay, no matter how far things drifted. Freedom without accountability. Exactly what I had seen weeks ago. "I know," I said quietly. He looked at me then, something unsettled finally breaking through his composure. "So that's it?" he asked again, but softer now. "You're just done with us?" I stood up this time, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to meet him at the same level. "I'm done with the version of us where I have to shrink to stay," I said. His eyes searched mine like he was still trying to find a version of me that would bend. That would give him something to work with. But there was nothing left to negotiate. "I can do better," he said. And maybe he believed that, in that moment. But I had learned something important. Better isn't something people offer when they're about to lose you. It's something they show when they still have you. And he hadn't. "I hope you do," I said. That seemed to land harder than rejection. Because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was final. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're walking away over what? A few arguments? Some misunderstandings?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'm walking away because of what those arguments revealed." He went quiet again. Because deep down he understood. He just didn't want to accept it. The rest of it happened without drama. No last-minute confession. No sudden honesty. No grand gesture to pull everything back from the edge. Just distance. He sat down eventually, staring at the floor like he was trying to piece together a version of events where he hadn't been part of the reason this happened. I picked up my phone. My keys. The small things that suddenly felt heavier than they should. "You're really leaving," he said. I paused by the door. "Yes." And for a second, I thought he might say something different. Something real. Something that acknowledged what had actually happened between us. But he didn't. He just nodded once, like he had run out of ways to control the narrative. And that was the moment I knew there was nothing left to save. I didn't block him. I didn't need to. For the first few days, my phone lit up more than usual. Short messages at first. "Hey, can we talk?" I think we ended that wrong. I read them. I just didn't respond. Not out of anger. Not to punish him. But because I had already said everything that needed to be said while I was still there. A few days later, the messages changed. Longer. More detailed. "I've been thinking a lot. I didn't realize how I made you feel. I just needed space, not this." That part almost made me pause. Not because it was convincing, but because it sounded like the version of understanding I had once waited for. The version that came too late. Because clarity offered after consequences isn't growth. It's reaction. I still didn't reply. By the second week, the messages slowed down, then turned into check-ins. "How are you? I hope you're okay. I miss you." And there it was. Not "I understand." Not "I was wrong." Not "I'm ready to take responsibility." Just "I miss you." I set my phone down, and for the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not relieved in a dramatic, overwhelming way. Just steady. Like something I had been carrying for months had quietly slipped off my shoulders, and I hadn't even realized how heavy it had been until it was gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Not because I stopped caring, but because I stopped negotiating with myself every time something didn't feel right. Stopped questioning my instincts. Stopped shrinking my reactions to fit someone else's comfort. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then more. His messages stopped completely. And strangely, that was when I knew it was truly over. Not when I walked out. Not when he tried to fix it. But when the absence settled in fully without pulling me back. I didn't feel the urge to check his social media. Didn't wonder who he was with. Didn't replay our conversations looking for things I could have said differently. Because for once, I didn't feel like I had lost something. I felt like I had stepped out of something that had been slowly taking pieces of me without giving anything solid back. And the clarity that came with that was worth everything. I thought about that word again. Controlling. The one that had stayed in my head for so long. The one that had made me question myself, second-guess my instincts, edit my own behavior just to avoid being labeled something I wasn't. But now I understood it differently. When someone calls your boundaries control, they're not asking for trust. They're asking for permission. Permission to move however they want without being questioned, without being accountable, without having to meet you in the middle. And when someone demands freedom but resents the moment you stop anchoring them, they weren't asking for independence. They were asking for a safety net. I never took anything from him. I didn't restrict him, didn't limit him, didn't stop him from doing anything he wanted to do. I simply stopped giving him something he was never entitled to in the first place. Unconditional emotional access without responsibility. And once that was gone, so was the version of him that stayed. Trust doesn't mean silence. Freedom doesn't mean immunity. And love doesn't survive in a space where accountability feels like an attack. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is give someone exactly what they asked for.